Well, hello, and greetings from outer space. Actually, I'm quite near where the United States sends off a lot of their rocket ships. We saw a space launch of sending up a rocket ship just this past Monday, which was awesomely cool. Anyway, it's a different subject. But here I am in outer space, and I think this is appropriate for what we're going to talk about today. There are like four most important lectures in this course. This is one of those four. And so it's one you're going to need to come back and refer to more than once. It's going to be very important on your examination, and it's just very important altogether. So what I'm going to do is make myself small. And the question we're answering is, what is the evidence that God does exist? And it's kind of ironic because we've been saying that materialists say there is no evidence. There can't be any evidence. It can't be evidence because of the fact that God doesn't exist. So no matter what you say, a person who doesn't believe that God exists or believe that God does not exist will say, there is no evidence you can show me because there is no God. And so we cannot accept evidence that says that God exists because God doesn't exist. So I'm going to show you that there is evidence. It's extremely strong evidence. Extremely strong evidence. I guess when I was an atheist, when I was 20 years old, when I was an atheist, I don't know if I really would have been convinced by this evidence, but I should have been because it's really very convincing. So let's just start off with the evidence that answers the question, what is the evidence that God does exist? Okay, so evidence number one, I'll drop down for a second. The presence of DNA language and information suggests an information giver. Now, I want you to catch that information giver thing because that's super important. The fact that there's DNA language and information suggests an information giver. And by the way, when we talk about materialism, you got to understand something kind of crazy. Materialism believes that the only thing that's real is material and the processes that go along with the material. But information is not material at all. It's totally not material. And yet information guides the whole biological process. The whole biological process. Your body, a cell, a COVID cell, all of them, virus, not cell, virus, all of them are guided by DNA. And DNA is information. And so, first, very interesting point. DNA is a language which has an alphabet of 4 basic units, very similar to letters in an alphabet. Now, in computer programming, generally speaking, computer program, it's also there's a fundamental language of 2 letters on and off. So this is a much more complicated language that has 4 basic units, which are just pretty close to letters in an alphabet because they spell things. Get what I just said? They spell things. DNA combines these letters to form words and sentences, which can store all of the instructions cells need to reproduce themselves, etc. If you don't have DNA in your cell, your cell is never going to reproduce. If your cell doesn't reproduce, it's going to die, and you're going to die. DNA is how the cells reproduce themselves because it gives the instructions. That should just really throw you off. How can a materialist say that an intelligent God doesn't exist when there are instructions for each living organism that tells it how to reproduce itself? These words are part of a brilliantly conceived language which conveys information. And the whole idea of information is absolutely mind-boggling. There's a whole field of study of biological information. And talk about biological information systems. And actually, there's a push to try to see if they can use DNA as a way, as a computer language. If there is information, there must be someone who designed the information and the system for communicating it. I mean, you just don't have information floating around. If there's information, always, 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 that information comes from an information giver. You just can't have information without someone who gives the information. This information giver has to be God, because God's the one that created the universe out of nothing. Has to be God because, good grief, the biological world in which we live, with bananas and mosquitoes and birds, fish, that biological world in which we live is incredibly complex. Where did all the information come from that guides all of those processes together? Well, an evolutionist will say it comes from evolution. But information? Information comes from evolution? How does that even happen? I mean, I don't even think it's conceivable. So this is an area, or one of many, 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 many areas where an evolutionist will simply close her eyes and say, well, yeah, the information doesn't come from anywhere. It comes from natural selection. It comes from chance mutations and natural selection. That's where it all comes from. You're like, good grief, you really believe that? You really believe that all of that information came by chance? We've never had information come by chance. So that's that evidence there. In my opinion, of course, I'm a Christian, so that's absolutely what I'm going to think. But I think that argument of DNA, it's it. It's over. Bust. I don't think anybody can argue against the DNA. They try to, but it's irrational. Information has to have a source, and it has to be an intelligent source. And the only source that could do that information for a whole planet is God. Okay, in real life, simple things do not increase in complexity by random chance. Okay, I guess I better say it twice. In real life, simple things do not increase in complexity by random chance. It just doesn't happen. In fact, I don't think you can find any example of a simple thing that becomes more complex by random chance. In real life, when random events happen by blind chance, they are almost always cause things to break down rather than to become more complex. There's a very, very interesting video that I saw this summer by an intelligence design scientist with a PhD. And he shows how when there is quote unquote evolution that's happening now, it's always that an organism loses something. It doesn't gain something. It doesn't become more complex. It becomes a little bit less complex. That there's more information there, and then a mutation happens, and because that mutation happens, there's less information, so that finch changes its color, or that moth changes its color, or something like that. But it's not because that creature has become more complex. It's actually because it's lost something. Because it's lost something, it no longer can do something it could do before. It's true in every life. I mean, it isn't true if you've got someone who has intelligence and purposely uses simple parts to make a complex also. You know, if you have somebody who can put everything together and figure out, like in the robot, Are You a Robot cartoon, where you've got a programmer who actually makes parts that are just parts much more complex. Simple parts, he turns them into circuits. He turns, he creates a programming language like DNA, and he puts all of that together in an operating system. And he's taking something that was a bunch of simple parts apart from each other, and he intelligently puts them all together. Yeah, then you can have something that grows by itself by random chance mutation. Never happens. It just can't happen. If there are complex organizations, there must be someone who purposely made them complex. Period. That's the only way it works. So that's a very, very strong argument. And I don't understand why this argument is not convincing to people who propose evolution, because we all know it's true. We know it's true. It's not like you just don't have things becoming more complex. Simple things don't get more complex. It just doesn't happen. Ever. So that being must be God. All right, number 3. If a human would need knowledge to invent an object, then if that object exists in nature, someone with knowledge must have invented it. This doesn't quite, I keep this principle here, even though it's a little hard to understand, but the deal is, scientists work to try to do bioengineering, and I think it's awesome what they do. They're doing bioengineering all the time. I've seen college does a lot of that bioengineering. They're trying to make plants better, corn healthier. They're trying to make all kinds of things, like just like trying to get a vaccine for COVID-19. So they're doing biological engineering, bioengineering. If you have something like corn, maize, Mackay, I think it's called Mackay. If you have something like that and you want to make it better, or if you want to, let's not, so you say, I want to make a new vegetable. And so I'm going to use all kinds of stuff with genetic information, all this stuff I'm going to put, and I'm going to make a new vegetable. Well, guess what? You have to know, you have to be brilliant. You have to have all kinds of knowledge. You have to have a real lot of skills and understanding how to do splicing and all that stuff. You gotta really know what you're doing, and you have to be really good at what you're doing. You have to be really smart. And if you have all those things together, you may be able to create something new. But that wouldn't happen by chance. It never happens by chance. If you need that kind of intelligence to create something new, a new kind of vegetable, well then, if that vegetable already exists in nature, someone with knowledge must have invented it. It just doesn't happen. Even simple human inventions like a mousetrap need knowledge in order to know how to make the spring, the bar, the plate for the bait, the wooden platform and the bracket, all in the proper sizes. Figure out how to connect it. If you need knowledge in order to do that, then if there's something in nature that exists that would need knowledge in order to be done, somebody with knowledge made it. Common sense tells us that whenever we find any object, even in nature, which could only have been invented by someone with knowledge, that object must have been invented by someone with knowledge. Now, you need to think of biological organisms as machines. But don't think of yourself as a machine, because we did the robot thing. You're not a machine. You're not a robot. You're someone. But when we look at biological machines, there are all kinds of machines. Just so many different kinds of machines. Now, when you look at those and you study them, you say, wow, this is incredibly complex. I don't think I could make this. I don't think I could make it. Well, okay. So that would mean that if it exists in nature, it must have been invented by someone who had knowledge. Because if we have to have knowledge in order to invent an object, then if that object already exists, someone with knowledge must have invented it. And we know this is true in real life. We know this is true in real life, but for some reason, evolutionists just ignore this. The universe has several laws. This is a very, very strong proof. The universe has several laws of nature, which are fine-tuned for life, which suggests that somebody fine-tuned them. Now, fine-tuning means that you have to have it exactly at the right place. If you have too much of it, it won't happen. If you have too little of it, it won't happen. It has to be just at the exact correct level. That's what fine-tuning is. And the universe is definitely fine-tuned. And all scientists now admit, super atheist scientists admit, that the fundamental laws of nature, if they were changed even slightly, life could not exist. Now, I gotta say this again. All scientists now admit that if the fundamental laws of nature were changed even slightly, life could not exist. This universe is perfectly tuned for life. This universe we're living in is perfectly tuned for life. And all scientists have come to face this. And I don't understand. This is such an incredibly powerful argument that there is a creator who has fine-tuned the universe, who has put everything together at exactly the right balance and exactly the right amounts so that they all work together. I don't understand it because it's so clear in the universe in which we're living now. I don't understand why scientists don't realize how serious this is and say, yeah, there's a creator. There's an intelligent creator. It's the only way this universe could be this way. Strong nuclear force. If it's changed a tiny bit, well, then everything's just stop existing. Weak nuclear force, same. Electromagnetic force, same. Gravitational constant. You change those things, even the tiniest bit. Change them the tiniest bit, and you know what happens? Everything stops existing. So I don't get it. This is a very powerful argument. This is a very powerful argument. There must be a creator God. You know, Stephen Hawking, I said this in another lecture, Stephen Hawking said that everything just came to exist out of nothing. But he's not really being honest because the law of gravity is there already. And he's not being honest because not only is the law of gravity there already, but it's perfect. If the law of gravity were different, then if the Big Bang started the Big Bang, guess what would happen? It would fizzle out. It wouldn't happen. You cannot have this universe we're living in unless all four of those laws are perfect. And this is not all. There's more than this. This is just the most impressive. So I don't understand how an evolutionist, I don't understand how an atheist can handle this. There are too many arguments that are just like, good grief, they're so strong that there is a creator in the universe. And these are all scientific arguments. They're all scientific. These are not like, well, this is what the Bible says. That's a different argument. If we come upon a machine, I'm not saying if we come upon a piece of rock on the ground. That's not what I'm saying. If we come upon a machine and we discovered that it was constructed so exactly, even if one piece would change, that machine would not function, then we would say that machine was fine-tuned by somebody. The universe is that machine. All of these laws, all of these forces are all working together properly so that life on Earth can exist. You change those constants, you change those forces, life can't exist. And yet life does exist. That's a very strong evidence that there's a God. God must have fine-tuned the universe. Okay, we're going to pause here and watch this video. Oops, go back.
Welcome to this edition of Great Minds with Michael Medved, where my guest is Dr. Stephen Meyer, who has kindly agreed to join us in discussing one of the most substantive, explosive, controversial issues imaginable. Scientific evidence, not philosophical, but scientific evidence for the existence of God. That's right. On this show, we don't hesitate to tackle the most controversial subjects that never go away because they are so important and they are, in fact, eternal. Yet also, because we're candid about it, they're also so very, very divisive. Now, many people would shy away from raising the topic of science and God, and particularly of science for God. But Steve Meyer never has. Steve is a friend, and he directs the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute here in Seattle, which produces this show. And in his best-selling books, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, Steve has fearlessly challenged some of the reigning orthodoxy about science and the origins of life and the origins of animal life and intelligent animal life. Now, as if this wasn't controversial enough, I want to talk about his next book project, which he's working on right now, and which actually was reflected in a award-winning journal essay he wrote in a peer-reviewed journal. That essay was called The Return of the God Hypothesis. The audience can find that essay along with more information about Steve and his work on this show's home on the internet. That's mindswithmedved.com. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe so you can be the first to find out about future episodes, and also so that you can donate to make sure that these episodes, these programs, continue. Steve, one of the most obvious questions about your writing an essay called The Return of the God Hypothesis is it seems to confirm all those terrible things that people have said about you over the years, which is that the so-called intelligent design movement, of which you are a leader, is really just a Trojan horse for people who are trying to allow for a religious comeback. Why would you risk confirming all these dark fears by talking about the return of the God hypothesis?
Great question. We're in kind of a double bind because we're also accused of being disingenuous and not willing to address these deeper questions. So when people say intelligent design is religion, we've said, no, it's not religion. It's based on scientific evidence, an established method of scientific reasoning. And the evidence of intelligent design in biology gets you to the conclusion that a designing intelligence of some kind must have played a role in the origin and history of life. But that leads to a second order question, a more philosophical question, granted, and that is, what is the nature or the identity of that designing intelligence? Who do you think designed life and the universe? And I actually think there's other scientific evidence that helps to answer that question. So this isn't one of the distinctions that we've made is we're not like many biblical creationists who base their theories on an interpretation of the book of Genesis. We're making an inference to intelligent design based on biological evidence. But I think there's other evidence from physics and cosmology that actually helps answer the question of the likely identity of the designer responsible for life in the universe. And so I am interested finally in what's the truth about these big questions. And so I get asked, who do you think the designer is? And I actually have an opinion about that, and I've developed that in this article that you mentioned.
Okay, you also write in the article about the rise and you say fall of some of the traditional arguments for God's existence. And you separate those arguments into cosmological arguments and design arguments. What's the difference?
The cosmological argument is the argument from the first cause, or the need for a first cause to explain the first effect. And there are a couple different forms of cosmological argument, but one of the popular ones in the Middle Ages was known as the Kalam cosmological argument. And it went like this: whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have a cause separate from itself. We call that cause God, said the medieval philosophers. That argument fell into some, not so much disrepute, but just disrepair in the period of the Enlightenment, as many people said, well, we'll grant you the first premise that whatever begins to exist must have a cause, but how do we really know the universe had a beginning? And there wasn't really a scientific way to settle that question. There were some philosophical arguments against what were called actual infinites, but there was no decided scientific evidence for a beginning to the universe. And it became more and more the default view during the 19th century and into the early 20th century that the universe was eternal and self-existent. It was infinite in time and space. It didn't have a beginning, so that in a sense, matter was the thing from which everything else came, matter and energy.
Is that related to what they used to call the steady state theory?
Right. The steady state was actually an attempt in the 1940s and 50s to resuscitate that kind of default view coming into the beginning of the century that was challenged by the discovery that the universe did have a beginning, what we now call the Big Bang Theory.
And you write about the impact of both the Big Bang Theory and Einstein's general theory of relativity on the traditional arguments against the existence of God.
Right. If that second premise is the key premise, does the universe have a beginning or not? It was it's just an absolutely fascinating episode in the history of science that during the last century, scientists were effectively able to answer that question. It's an ancient question that goes all the way back to the Greeks. Is the universe finite or infinite? Is it eternal and self-existent? Or did it perhaps require a creator beyond itself? Well, the evidence that the universe had a beginning was startling and shocking, and it upset a lot of philosophical sensibilities. But it started in the 19-teens with Einstein's formulation of the theory of general relativity. His field equations implied that there had been a beginning. And then in the 1920s and 30s, the observational astronomers, in particular Edwin Hubble, found evidence of an expanding universe that suggested that if the universe was expanding in the forward direction of time, if you went backwards in time, that eventually all the galaxies that were moving away from us now would have been clumping closer and closer together, eventually getting back to a place where they would have all congealed, marking the beginning of the universe itself. So it was a striking kind of twofold discovery in theoretical physics and then separately in astronomy. Scientists came to the conclusion that the universe had a beginning from two separate lines of evidence.
Okay, I know that this is something that my late father tried to explain to me. My father, who you knew
I
well,
met your wonderful father.
yes,
Yeah.
was a solid-state physicist.
Right.
And the challenge to people who believe that, well, somehow if the universe all began in a little microscopic, and there was a big bang and it's been exploding ever since, and expanding ever since. Part of the way that's answered is what's called a multiverse theory. And it's very difficult to wrap your mind around it. Can you explain what is that?
Well, right. There's a second wrinkle on the discovery of the cosmological discovery. The first wave is that the universe had a definite beginning. The second wave came in cosmological physics or in theoretical physics, and that was the discovery that in addition to the universe having a beginning, the universe was finely tuned in its configuration of matter and in the strength and relationship of the fundamental laws from the beginning. So the universe had a beginning, but it was finely tuned from the beginning, such that we live in a kind of Goldilocks universe where the fundamental forces of the universe, the expansion rate of the universe, the speed of light, all of these different parameters are not too strong, not too weak, not too fast, not too slow. Everything is just right to allow for the possibility of life.
Well, I know that's the argument about privileged planet, which we've talked about before, about
Right.
planet Earth.
So
How does that apply to the larger universe, which is, of course, infinitely larger than this little one speck?
Exactly. The Privileged Planet is a book about the fine-tuning of our Earth and local solar system. It turns out that there's a deeper, more fundamental fine-tuning that affects the very laws of physics themselves. And the initial configuration of matter or what physicists call mass energy, at the very beginning of the universe. And that's where the multiverse comes in, because many physicists, starting in about the 50s and 60s, with in particular Fred Hoyle, who'd been an advocate of the steady state idea, a staunch atheist, because of discoveries that he made, discoveries of fine-tuning parameters that he himself made, came to the conclusion that there must be an intelligence behind the universe. He said, in fact, that a common sense interpretation of the evidence suggests a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry to make life possible. It was a dramatic shift in his worldview as a result of these discoveries.
Did he really use the term monkey?
Monkeyed, he did. I like that.
Kind of a little Darwinian.
Yeah, exactly. The monkeys make it into the origins theories, even if it's the physics origins.
Even if it's a super intellect monkey.
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't that fascinating?
It is fascinating. Anyway, the multiverse comes in at that point because people say we can't actually have intelligent design as the explanation for the origin of the universe. And they then posit, and there were some physics justifications of this, but they posit not just one universe, the one that is beautifully finely tuned in which we live, but many, many, many other universes. In fact, so many that they would render our universe or a universe with life-friendly conditions probable somewhere. And then the supposition was that we just happen to be the somewhere, the lucky ones who are in the life-friendly universe.
I see. Now, do they concede that we are the only intelligent life in this universe? They don't concede that.
No, but they would concede that the fine-tuning parameters appear incredibly improbable from our point of view. And what they attempt to explain that improbability away by positing the existence of all these other universes, a gabillion others that are causally disconnected to ours, but exist somewhere.
Okay, that seems like a philosophical argument. What I've found it difficult to grasp is there's at least a claim that there is some scientific evidence of the existence of other universes.
No scientific evidence of the existence of the other universes, but some theoretical models in physics that would render a belief in them at least plausible. The problem comes in for the multiverse, though, in that for the probabilities in our universe to be affected, there must be some causal connection between the different universes, or at least some common cause that produced them all, so that we could think of our universe as kind of the winner of a lottery, a big cosmic lottery. We're the lucky winner of a cosmic lottery. But for that to be true, there has to be some universe-generating mechanism that's spitting out lots of other universes, so that there's some connection, at least a common cause.
Is the theory that the other universes are governed by the same laws of physics?
Oh, no, they would have maybe other laws of physics and other fine-tuning parameters. That's the whole idea. Then
Okay.
the unique set that we have would be one of a great ensemble of possibilities. But
you're saying there's no scientific evidence. We haven't gotten some radio transmission.
No, nothing like that. In fact, the very concept of a universe is, the net total of all that is. So it's a little bit contradictory at that level philosophically. But here's the rub. The models of theoretical physics that have been proposed to explain where these other universes would come from, so-called universe-generating mechanisms, have invariably themselves required prior fine-tuning to explain how you would even get these other universes.
So you need to come back to mind.
You have fine-tuning is a product of mind.
And that brings us to the other explanation, the other argument, the argument by design.
Exactly. But now notice something. Whereas the argument for design that I've made in biology involves the origin of events, the origin of life and animal form that arises along the cosmic timeline well after the beginning of the universe, such that it's at least logically possible that it might be produced by an intelligent agent within the cosmos someplace after the beginning. The evidence from fine-tuning suggests a transcendent form of intelligence because it's prior to the existence and even possible existence of any entity within the cosmos that could be alive. In other words, no intelligent agent can be the product of the very laws of physics that apply to it and that make its life possible. So this evidence of design, I think, points to a transcendent source, just as the Big Bang itself points to the need for a transcendent cause of the universe. So whereas the argument from design in biology leaves open the question of the nature and identity of the designing intelligence, it might be immanent within the cosmos or a transcendent designer. The evidence from physics and cosmology points in a decidedly transcendent direction, such that when you take all these classes of evidence together, and this is the argument that I make in the paper, that the best explanation is theistic design, not a space alien, not a deistic creator who creates at the beginning and then never has anything more to do with the creation, because we have evidence of design down the timeline in biology. So not a deistic creator, not a space alien, not a pantheistic notion of God, because that notion of God is a God that has no mind, no conscious agency. That's an impersonal connection or energy force. Only theism that posits a God who creates at the beginning but then acts after the beginning can explain the whole ensemble of the evidence.
When you were talking about down the timeline, evidence of a participation in God after this initial Big Bang, and because we're talking now about the return of the God hypothesis.
Right.
Are you talking about the Cambrian explosion?
Cambrian explosion, origin of life, maybe other discrete events in the history of life where we see a massive infusion of biological or genetic information in order to account for the patterns we see in the fossil record.
Okay, your colleague Michael Denton has taken this idea of fine-tuning, and I should explain that when you talk about the fine-tuning, for people who haven't read about this, it's really extraordinary. I mean, all the things that allow us to be sitting here and having this conversation, aside from these complicated machines that human beings have invented, require so many particulars and unlikely particulars of temperature and the way that the atmosphere is composed and the way that the gravity is implied and the size of the
balance
Earth.
Between the fundamental forces of gravitation and the strong and weak nuclear force, the expansion rate of the universe, and the fine-tuning is to an exquisite degree. There's one fine-tuning parameter that is hyper-exponentially fine-tuned. It's the original configuration. They call it the fine-tuning of the entropy. It has to do with the original arrangement of the mass energy at the beginning of the universe. It's hyper-exponentially fine-tuned, which means it's fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123. We can't even get our mind around a number that big. It's an extremely tiny tolerance.
That's bigger than the national debt.
Bigger than the national debt, exactly.
A 10?
10 to the 10th, and then raising that number to the 123rd power. There are more zeros in that number than there are elementary particles in the entire universe. And it's one part in that enormous number. This way or that way, and life would not be possible.
I'm just trying to absorb that. I hope everybody out there is as well. Because, okay, so Michael Denton says that you apply this argument of fine-tuning not just to the Big Bang, but to other aspects of existence.
Planet Earth, the distance of the Earth from the sun, the properties of water. He's just come out with a fascinating new book on the amazing multiple properties of water that make life possible. So there are many fine-tuning parameters. Jay Richards and Guillermo Gonzalez, and you've interviewed Jay, have developed a really interesting fine-tuning hypothesis just about the need for the different parameters that are necessary to make life on Earth possible, and that curiously, those same parameters make it possible for us to discover the basic structure of the universe.
Okay, if you discover, and I've interviewed Dr. Gonzalez on the radio show.
Right.
If you do discover some intelligent life on some other planet some point in the future, does that blow this fine-tuning argument out of the water?
No, I don't think so. There are different fine-tuning arguments, but the fundamental fine-tuning is the fine-tuning of the basic laws and constants of physics, the strength of those fundamental forces, and they apply throughout the whole universe. And the thing about them is that they're necessary conditions of there being life at all anywhere in the universe. So they make it, in fact, possible to consider that there might be life in other places. But there are other considerations that may have made some astronomers skeptical about that. In fact, two local University of Washington astronomers, Peter Ward and colleague, I'm dropping his name right now, but they wrote a book called, Don Brownlee wrote a book called Rare Earth. And whereas there are lots and lots of possible planets and galaxies out there, the number of factors that have to be just right to make life possible actually render all those other planets small in comparison to the number of things you need to get right. So they're actually skeptical that there would be a lot of life-friendly planets.
As Dorothy said, there's no place like home.
No place like home.
Yeah. You had an interesting encounter with an atheist, prominent atheist cosmologist named Lawrence Krauss.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Well, it was a debate at the University of Toronto, and I came into the debate hoping to discuss this issue of the cosmological origins. And he started the debate with a fair amount of personal invective, and we ended up only debating my ideas about intelligent design and biology. And it was somewhat, it wasn't my best performance. I got a migraine in the middle of my opening statement. And I couldn't see my slides anymore, which was a little difficult. But it came out kind of well because at the end we got some good exchanges. And then Richard Dawkins weighed in, and I'd never been able to lure him into a direct exchange. Dawkins defended Krauss, who claimed that I had misrepresented the Darwinian mechanism by claiming that there was an element of randomness in it. And many evolutionary biologists ended up attacking Krauss, saying that he was misrepresenting the Darwinian mechanism. Dawkins weighed in to say, well, this Meyer, he doesn't understand that Darwinism is a non-random process, or that natural selection is a non-random process. It's true that natural selection is non-random, but the random mutations it acts on are completely random. And it's for that very reason that they can't explain the origin of new information. If you've got a section of functioning digital code and you start introducing random changes to that code, you're going to degrade that information long before you get a new program or operating system. And the same problem applies in biology and in the origin of the genetic information we need to make new forms of life. So I got to make that argument in print. My response went viral, and so we kept the debate going in print, and it worked out pretty well.
Okay, that's why we need the return of the God hypothesis. Is that going to be the title of the book?
Don't know yet. I'm still conceiving of it, but it's I'm building on these articles I've written with some new stuff that I'm doing in cosmology.
Well, Steve, thank you for your contributions, and thank you for being with us for these amazing and mind-blowing, really, to use a 60s term, conversations that we've been able to have. And if you want more information about Steve's work and about forthcoming programs of Great Minds with Michael Medved, go to our internet home, which is mindswithmedved.com. You can get information about Steve's work. You can sign up. You can also subscribe on iTunes as well. for mindswithmedved.com. And by the way, you're very much encouraged to donate to support this programming. Stay tuned and find out about other offerings from this series, Great Minds with Michael Medved.